In chapter 25, we turn our focus to plant evolution and specifically the diversity of land plants. And so we're going to walk through the major groups, which include our mosses, then our ferns, gymnosperms, and then angiosperms. And we're going to look at how they change throughout evolutionary history, the key adaptations for each of the group, and some specific reproductive changes that make each group a little bit distinctive from one another. The plant kingdom evolved from a group of green and red algae. The supergroup they came from is the Archaeoplastida, and they specifically evolved from green algae ancestors called streptophytes. This group is the group that includes both plants and their green algae ancestors. But what makes plants different from green algae is that they have a few specific traits that allow them to survive in terrestrial conditions. So if you think about land compared to water, the major difference, the most obvious difference, is water. So if we're thinking about an aquatic environment, water is never going to be a limiting factor. And then in a land environment, water is almost always going to be a limiting factor. Land environments are obviously much sunnier. There's also greater swings in temperature. It takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water. So water usually changes very slowly, whereas the environmental shifts on land can happen very, very quickly. And we can go from very hot to very cold in a short amount of time. And then finally, on land, we have gravity that's an issue. So in the water provides some support. So if you think about a kelp forest, that kelp forest is essentially floating, stretching all the way up from the bottom to the top of the water column. Whereas on land, the plant has to provide its own support. There are several distinctive features that allow plants to live on land and to be well adapted to land. One of those is that their body is composed of tissue. So when an organism is made up of tissues, which are specialized cells, they usually have a specific function. So for example, you have muscle tissue throughout your body whose specialized function is movement. When organisms have specialized tissues, it allows their body to be larger and more complex. Now, as far as land plants are concerned, this means that they have a low surface area to volume ratio. Essentially, what happens is that the larger a cell gets, the more surface area it has. And if the surface area is outpaced by the volume, or the volume is not high enough for the surface area, you can have issues with transporting substances through a cell, like from one side to the other. But you can also have problems with not being able to take in enough nutrients or water, or losing too much water. And so land plants are a balance between taking in enough water and not losing it, basically being an appropriate size so that they don't lose too much water because their surface area to volume ratio is a little bit mixed up. So as an organism's size increases, its surface area doesn't increase as quickly as its volume does. So what this means is that a larger organism has less surface area relative to their internal volume. So in turn, that's important because it means that they're going to lose less water for your body size. So water loss happens less. Less surface area means less opportunities for water to escape from the organism. Those tissues come from structures called apical meristems. So apical meristems are an important adaptation that allows for these plants to have different tissue types. So apical meristems are essentially just regions of high numbers of cell division. They happen at the tips of the roots and the tips of the shoots. So your plants are growing down from the roots, up from the shoots, and this allows for those specialized tissues and organs which then in turn allows for larger, more complex bodies. Land plants also have some distinctive reproductive features. Specifically, they utilize something called alternation of generations, which we're going to come back to multiple times throughout this chapter. They have multicellular embryos, which is different from our green algae. They also have dry air resistant reproductive cells, which basically means their reproductive cells don't have to be tied to water and they aren't going to dry out if they're exposed to air. And then related to that, they have specialized structures that are going to help to protect and disperse those reproductive cells. As we go through each of our groups of land plants, we're going to talk about how these distinctive reproductive features change and how each are unique to the particular group that we are studying. We're going to get very familiar with something called alternation of generations. I'm going to talk about what it looks like in each of the groups. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about moss alternation of generations. That'll come in the next video. And then as we go through each of our plant groups, we're going to talk about just the main differences, how this really unique adaptive feature changes depending on the type of plant that we're looking at. Sometimes this is also called the sporic life cycle because there is a stage where spores are produced from a structure known as the sporophyte. So we'll talk about that. For right now, it would be really great if you could learn a couple of definitions. So the alternation of generations process is going to involve two types of multicellular bodies. Essentially, what's going to happen is one physical structure of the plant is going to sort of grow into another very different structure. And they are going to be linked by the production of spores and the production of gametes. Recalling Biology 101, we have a haploid generation of cells. Haploid means they have only one copy of each type of cell. And we are going to indicate haploid by the letter N. So haploid just means one copy of each type of chromosomes. N indicates the number of chromosomes. So if we have N equals, sorry, that went a little crooked, N equals a number of chromosomes, this just means that we have one copy of each of those chromosomes. The haploid generation is called the gametophyte generation, and that gametophyte is going to produce the gametes. So the word phyte, or the root word phyte, means plant. So the gametophyte is the generation of plants that produces the gametes. And of course, from Biology 101, we learned that those gametes are sperm and eggs. The other multicellular body type is called the diploid generation. For diploid, we indicate this as 2N. And this means that we have two copies of all of our chromosome types. The diploid generation is called the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is the plant version that produces the spores. So it is the spore plant. The spore plant. So the spore plant produces those spores. Now, something that is a little bit odd is that the gametes are produced by mitosis. So this is backwards. Oops, excuse me, let me undo that. This is backwards from the process of mitosis and meiosis that we learned in Biology 101, because in 101 we learned that meiosis produces gametes. But in alternation of generations, we are going to make haploid sperm and eggs by mitosis, and we are going to produce spores by meiosis. So we're actually still going to do cell division, we're still going to produce gametes, but it's going to look a little bit different than the process that you learned in 101. So land plants have multicellular embryos. So humans have multicellular embryos as well. You're probably at least vaguely familiar with this. When a sperm fertilizes an egg, that egg begins to divide, and then the cells that it divides into are eventually going to grow into the different regions of the organism. The exact same thing is going to happen in plants. So we are going to have sperm and eggs in plants as well. They are going to combine together to produce multicellular sporophytes. Now, don't worry about the sporophytes part right now. Basically, those embryos are going to divide, and they are going to develop into our plant structures. However, what type of structure the sporophyte develops into is going to depend on which version of alternation of generations that we're talking about. So we are going to have fertilized embryos that are those zygotes, those fertilized embryos are called zygotes. They are going to divide into multicellular sporophytes. Honestly, there is nothing too earth-shattering here. This is the combining of sperm and eggs into the fertilized zygote, which then begins to divide to produce that embryo. So nothing new there. We've just got some new words to describe what's happening. Plant embryos depend on maternal tissues for food. This is no different than a bird egg or a uterus. So just like fetuses in a human uterus are being nourished by maternal tissues, just like baby chicks in an egg or baby turtles in an egg are being nourished by the contents of that egg, exact same thing is happening. The reason that we talk about it here, though, is that one, many of you probably are not familiar with the idea that plants have those maternal tissues to nourish their embryos as well, but also because this is the first time we're seeing this from an evolutionary perspective. So this is kind of new. Depending on the semester, you may or may not have done the plant lab already, but if you have done the plant lab, you would have looked at the Zea mays specimen. This is a corn kernel, and in the corn kernel, you saw something called an endosperm. It's basically the top 2/3 or so of a corn kernel, and that endosperm is the tissue that is nourishing the developing plant. So it's just an energy source for that baby plant. Again, nothing new here. We're just talking about it with respect to plants instead of animals. So this is different because embryos were not present in those green algae, but all land plants have these embryos, and because they are important and because all land plants have them, land plants are actually called embryophytes. Just means plants with a little embryo. So embryo plant. The plants have a little embryo. As part of the alternation of generations, we are going to see something called spores. So spores are another adaptation for reproduction in terrestrial environments. Until we start to see the movement onto land, our algae ancestors to the land plants were producing solely in water. They had flagellated sperm that would swim to the egg. Again, nothing new here. We're just talking about it in the context of plants. And so spores are a new structure that allow for plants to live on land. Spores are coated with a polymer called sporopollenin. And sporopollenin is important because it coats the outside of those spores and keeps them from drying out. It also keeps them from bacteria or fungal infection, basically so they can survive for long periods of time. And because they're dry and they're tiny and they're light, they can be dispersed through dry air. You can see some pictures, different pictures of spores here. I really like this electron microscope image in the bottom right-hand corner just because it shows some of those really cool textures. Again, we haven't really talked about what a spore is, but we will do that once we get to alternation of generations. All right, a couple more words. In the reproductive parts of the plants, we have something called gametangia. Gametangia are structures that help to generate, protect, and disperse plant gametes. So basically, these are just protective reproductive structures. There's also sporangia. Sporangia are going to protect the spores. So again, these words are not really anything new. They're telling us what they're doing. The gametes are being protected in the gametangia, and the spores are being protected in the sporangia. Most of these structures are structures that you're probably unfamiliar with. You probably didn't even know they were there. So some of this is going to be a little bit weird. When we talk about alternation of generations, that often confuses students because we tend to think of reproduction in the human context. We have a fertilized zygote, and then that zygote divides into an embryo that is fully contained within the parent, and then you give birth to basically what amounts to as a tiny human. But in alternation of generations, we actually have two distinctive forms, one that gives rise to the other in the same plant life cycle.